Hey everyone! In the last lesson, we looked at the anatomy of the mouth. We talked about a couple things with the tongue, the areas of the mouth, and we focused on a little bit about teeth. We also introduced the idea of the pharynx and the esophagus, and today we're going to focus on the function of all of these parts. Here, we've seen this image several times. The major accessory or the major organs are going to be the mouth that we're going to talk about, the esophagus, and the pharynx. And there are a few accessory organs that we're going to talk about as well, such as the tongue and salivary glands, which both aid in digestion. We're going to focus on the mouth first and their function. The whole point of the mouth is to help break down the food into smaller parts, and we do this through chewing our food with our teeth. The process of chewing scientifically is known as mastication. Within the mouth, there's also the tongue, and the tongue helps basically break down this food, and also saliva is released to help this breakdown as well. The other function of the tongue is to help initiate swallowing as food is moving from your mouth into your pharynx and essentially down your esophagus. Last but not least, there are taste buds on our tongue to allow us to taste for different things. There are four major things that you can taste. You can taste sour, salty, sweet, and bitter tastes. So again, when we talk about taste, we can taste things as sour, bitter, salty, and sweet. And fun fact, different areas of our tongue actually have better taste for certain things. So, for example, the back of our tongue usually does better for things that are going to be like bitter, if I remember correctly. The next thing we're going to hit on is actually an accessory organ, and these are called salivary glands. Salivary glands release a product that we know as saliva. Saliva is a mixture of mucus but also serous fluids, and the whole point of saliva is to help moisten and it helps bind food together into a mass that we swallow. This mass that is basically bonded food is called a bolus. And the whole point of putting food into a bolus is to make chewing and swallowing a lot easier. Now, in terms of more of the makeup of saliva, it contains several enzymes, but one of the major ones is salivary amylase. Amylase is an enzyme that actually begins breakdown of starch in digestion. So remember, starch is a carbohydrate. There's also pancreatic amylase, but this is not released in the mouth. Saliva also contains lysozymes and antibodies, and these again help inhibit and break apart bacteria that could potentially get into your body and make you sick. Overall, the function is to dissolve chemicals so that we're able to break them down, but also so we can taste them as well. The next two organs we're going to talk about and focus on are pharynx and esophagus. The pharynx and esophagus both serve as a passageway. The pharynx, though, serves as a passageway for foods, fluids, and air. So when I say fluids, I'm talking about things like water and milk and juice. Food is essentially going to be propelled down the pharynx to the esophagus using two skeletal muscle layers in the pharynx, and they alternate contractions of these muscle layers that we know as peristalsis to help propel the food. The next one we're going to talk about is the esophagus. Sometimes we call this the gullet. This is also a passageway, but it's a passageway for food and liquids, and it does this through the same method of peristalsis. Again, like I said, it's passageway for food, and then I didn't put this in your notes, and liquids only. What happens to the air? Well, air is going to branch off of the pharynx, and instead of going down the esophagus, air typically is going to go down to your lungs through your trachea and bronchioles. Now let's focus specifically on activities occurring in the mouth, pharynx, and esophagus. So if we talk about the overall function of food ingestion and breakdown, ingestion, remember, is placing food into your mouth. Again, it's physically broken down through chewing, but it's also chemically broken down at the same time by mixing in saliva and moving it around with your tongue and cheek muscles. Tongue and cheek muscles, this is more of a physical breakdown, whereas saliva is going to be chemical. One thing to know about saliva production is it tends to increase in response to mechanical pressure. So the moment that you put food in your mouth and it feels the pressure within your mouth and the tongue, it's going to start releasing saliva. I oftentimes like to hold different things in my mouth. Like if I'm trying to bend over, I'll hold a pencil in my mouth. You can feel saliva start to be created and released. There's also emotional stimuli. So if you smell something very yummy in the kitchen, or if you're just daydreaming and you're thinking about a nice warm cherry pie ready for you guys to eat, that's also going to increase saliva production as well. Again, we did talk about this. Saliva tends to have something called salivary amylase, which begins starch production. And one thing to note is that in terms of function, no food absorption is going to occur in the mouth. The next function that is the overall function is food propulsion. Again, this occurs whenever you swallow or through a process called peristalsis. Remember, pharynx and esophagus actually technically have no digestive function. All they do is serve as passageways to the stomach. The pharynx does help with swallowing, but that's still not digesting food. One thing to know about swallowing is scientifically it's called deglutition. So if you think of gluttony, which is one of the seven deadly, or gluttony, which is one of the seven deadly sins, they like to eat a lot. So usually that's how I kind of remember this. You're swallowing food when you eat. So I think of gluttony, the seven deadly sin. There are two phases of swallowing. There is the buccal phase, and buccal, remember, is the area used for your cheeks or your cheeks of your mouth. And then you have your pharyngeal esophageal phase. Let's first focus on this buccal phase. This phase is voluntary, which means we have control over swallowing. It's going to occur in the mouth, hence why we have buccal for the cheeks. Food is essentially chewed during this phase. It's going to be mixed with saliva. It forms that bolus mass, and then that bolus is going to go into your pharynx with the help of the tongue. The second phase of this is your pharyngeal esophageal phase. This is involuntary, so once you actually swallow it, the movement through the esophagus is going to be involuntary. Smooth muscles take over. And again, it does this through the process called peristalsis. Also know that during this phase is that food tends to move down your esophagus to your stomach, and this is because your nasal and respiratory passageways are going to be blocked. For example, the tongue helps block it from coming back up the mouth. The soft palate closes off any nasal passages, and your epiglottis covers the glottis so things don't go down the respiratory passageways to the lungs. Other things about this is that there are also different sphincters to help regulate. There's something called the cardioesophageal sphincter. This is located between the esophagus and the stomach, and it helps open up and allow food to drop into the stomach. Now, oftentimes, if you tend to have a lot of heartburn or acid reflux, it's because the cardioesophageal sphincter is not working properly. So things from your stomach come back up your esophagus. So here are the two different phases. Here we're saying the screen is the bolus in the mouth. And up here we have a sphincter that is going to open up when we swallow and things go down our esophagus instead of coming over to our trachea. So here is the bolus again moving down. We're going to see that that trachea closes off so it can't go there because the epiglottis covers that opening. And so it's going to slide down the correct pipe. So here is it going down the esophagus. And then once it gets to the bottom of the esophagus, there's also another sphincter down here that will open to allow that bolus and that food to go into the stomach. And that's the end of today's lesson. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and I hope you guys have a great day.